University in Cairo, the Tahrir campus, where we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the university. I'm very glad to receive you all, to welcome you all to this lecture, and I have three motives for being glad. First of all, seeing you all here and welcoming you to the lecture. My second motive for being glad is that we're organizing this lecture in collaboration with the Al-Walid Center for American Studies and Research. This is one of our first instances of collaboration, and we hope that we continue on this path and cooperate more with them, with the center. But my third motive for being glad is that I welcome my very good friend, Professor Karen Jacobsen. Karen, you're most welcome, as usual, in Cairo. It's very nice to see you here. Professor Jacobsen is our distinguished visiting professor for this semester. This is an expression of the good fortune that we've had. We were not certain that when we invited her that she would be available to come, but she made time and she came to Cairo to spend with us a week to 10 days to address our students a few days ago, to address you here tonight about an issue that is obviously of interest to all of you, and I think of interest to many people who are not here today also. And this is the U.S. immigration policy in the Trump era. Those interested and those not interested in migration studies have been following the evolution, the changes, the discourse of the current president of the United States over immigration, over refugees. It has become one of the facets of his outlook on the world, his perspective on the world and on international relations, not only from humanitarian point of view, but I think from the perspective of organizing the world, of governing the world, of the rules that should guide the international system. So Professor Jacobsen will talk to us about this perspective of President Trump, and she will focus in particular on refugee policy. Refugee policy is, refugees are international migrants with specific status under international law, and a status which apparently is not that recognized by the President of the United States. He's not alone, of course, in not recognizing the specifics of this status, but he is the President of the most powerful country in the world, and this is a matter of interest, if not concern, for all those that are following global affairs and in particular migration and refugee affairs. So we all are extremely excited to learn about how Professor Jacobsen analyzes this policy of President Trump, how she puts it in perspective, international perspective, and in the U.S. perspective, what the origins of this policy are, and what it can result in for refugees on the one hand, those seeking protection on the one hand, and also for the international system as a whole, including the countries where refugees have taken or have sought protection when leaving their countries. So I will leave it at that, and I will give the floor to Professor Jacobsen. She will talk for around 40 minutes, after which we will open the floor. I will also have some comments to make, but the floor will be open to all attendees to put questions to Professor Jacobsen and to express some of their views briefly, if possible, since the attendance is quite important, and we're glad that the attendance is quite important. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Of course, I'm sorry. I forgot.
Oh.
I forgot to introduce you.
That's okay.
To introduce you, Professor Jacobsen is a professor of global migration at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. She is a political scientist by formation. She has graduated from, I always have problems, in Witwatersrand University in South Africa, a very famous and University of Quality in South Africa, and she has had her PhD from a quite famous university, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology from MIT. Unfortunately, I do not have all the details. No, but I want to mention the research that you have done and the books that you have written, and your book of 2005 in particular, which is largely used in classrooms studying refugees. I will leave it at that, and if you have questions about the background of Professor Jacobsen, you will be, of course, most welcome to put these questions to you after you have talked.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been coming to Cairo for, gosh, where are we? I don't know, 15. Yeah, since 2008. So it's always a pleasure to come back here and to work with my dear colleagues at AUC. So thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for coming. So what I want to do in this talk today is three things. The first is to locate U.S. immigration policy in the world of immigration, of global immigration. Can you all hear me okay? And then I want to talk a bit about U.S. immigration policy, because the U.S. is, one of the main countries of immigration, one of the main destination countries in the world. So I want to talk a bit about the broader immigration policy, and then focus more on refugees in particular, and give you a sense of how it looks, how U.S. refugee policy looks, and asylum policy, and then talk about how things have changed or not changed under the Trump administration. Okay? So that's the overview right there. Okay, so let's talk about U.S. immigration. U.S. has one of the highest populations of immigrants in the world. Not the highest per capita, but one of the highest for sure. In 2017, the U.S. had about 45 million international migrants in the U.S. So when we think about immigrants to the U.S., they're also sometimes called foreign-born, and they're referred to people who were not born in the U.S. So I am a foreign-born citizen of the U.S., and I'm counted in that number of immigrants, right? So that number of 45 million immigrants includes undocumented people, people on different kinds of visas, people who are legal permanent residents, people who are citizens but were not born in the US, okay? So that is a large number, including many different people. And in 2017, it was about 13 or 14% of the US population, which is around 325 million people. This number, 13%, is high. And what you'll see here it's growing. But from this graph, the blue line is the number of immigrants to the US over time from 1980. But the orange line is the proportion of immigrants to the population. And that proportion has stayed pretty steady. It dropped off in 1970s and 80s, but it's creeping up again. But it was, it's always been around this number, okay? So just to go back to this slide, the US has 45 million international immigrants, but every year coming into the US are around 787,000. So 750,000 foreign-born enter into the US, okay? Put this in a global perspective. In the world, if we define international migrants as people who have lived in another country, not of their birth, for more than a year, that number is around about 257 actually million people. And a big, some countries, like some of the Gulf countries, have a very high population of immigrants to their populations. In some countries, it's around about 90% in the Gulf. But the US, we're around about 13%, and of course, some other countries have much lower percentages. So that's just to put US in this global perspective. So how do people come to the US if you're immigrating to the US? The US has had several acts, laws, that have been put in place to manage immigration since the high point of immigration in the early 1900s. But the main one is the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1990 that sets an annual limit on the US immigration of 675,000 people. And of those people coming into the US, there are basically four categories in which you can come. The most important, the biggest category by far, 64% of people coming into the US come through what's called family reunification. So it's people joining their families, maybe joining a spouse, maybe joining their parents or their children, but people who are coming in to join family. That is by far the largest number of people. The second category is employment-based immigration. This is people who have skills that are valuable to the US can come into the US, depending on, there are different kinds of visas that are issued to people coming in for employment reasons. Then there is humanitarian immigration, refugees and asylum seekers, and I'll talk about that in a lot of detail in a minute. And until recently, until last year, there was what was called the diversity visa, the diversity visa lottery, which was an effort by the US to increase the cultural diversity of the US by issuing a visa lottery. So if you were from a country where the US did not have many people from that country, a quota was given to the country of visas, and you could apply for a visa to come to the US. And depending on the population of the country, that quota was proportional to the population. And the idea was just to increase the diversity of immigrants and the diversity of the US population. And it was a pretty cool thing. I've often sat in a taxi and going to the airport, going anywhere, and talked to the taxi driver, and he told me that he won the diversity lottery, and that's why he came to the US. And so anybody, you didn't have to have money, you just won it, and then you were enabled to come. That diversity lottery, sadly, has been cut by the Trump administration. No more. But we'll talk more about other things that the Trump administration has done. So now basically we've got family reunification, employment, and economic ways of entering the US, and humanitarian entry to the US. This structure of U.S. immigration policy is fairly typical of most countries. Their immigration policies kind of look like that, more or less. So let's talk briefly about U.S. refugee policy. It's sort of an interesting history. I'm going to keep it very short because we could talk about it a lot. So until the 1940s, the U.S. had no policy governing refugees. The U.S. was fairly open, well, it wasn't in the 1940s, there were some racial controls on immigration, but basically there were no federal laws that distinguish between immigrants and refugees or asylum seekers. But after the Second World War, there were as you know, about 7 million internally displaced people in Europe after the war. They were called displaced persons. And Congress realized that they would have to do something, they would have to help Europe as part of the way in which the US was helping Europe after the Second World War. And one of the things Congress did was in 1948 created the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed about 350,000 European refugees to come into the US. So that was our first sort of official refugee policy. And then in 1960, well, as you know, in about 1950, the United Nations was formed after the Second World War. And one of the things that happened in the United Nations was a treaty that was the convention, the 1951 Refugees Convention, in which the then member states, of which, as you recall, back in 1950, today we have about 180 states in the world. Back in 1950, we only had about 50, right? The whole world practically was colonized. So we had lots, big empires, British empires and well, the Germans were finished, but Portuguese, Spanish, French empires. So we didn't have that many countries. But we had about 50 member states, and they all came together to figure out some way to sort out the displaced person problem in Europe, and came up with the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugees Convention, which was essentially formed to address the problem of the post-war displacement, and was expected that it would be sorted out and taken care of. But as, of course, we know, it was not sorted out and taken care of because refugees continued to happen, so this convention persisted. And along with the convention was formed a UN agency that was given the mandate to take care of refugees, right? And that is, as we know, the High Commissioner's Office for Refugees. And that office was set up along with the convention to take care of refugees. So the countries that signed on to this convention in 1951 were signing on to a convention that essentially was trying to deal with the problem in Europe after the war. And as time went by into the 1960s and other countries developed refugee problems, this convention turned out to need to be adapted, adjusted. And so a protocol was added called the 1967 Protocol, which took away the geographic and temporal limitations of the 51 Convention. So this protocol, as it was created, is basically the same as the 1951 Convention, except it's aimed more broadly it's not just aimed at Europe. This is the protocol that the US signed, okay? So most countries have signed both the 1951 Convention and the 67 Protocol, but the US, there's no reason to sign both, and the US only signed the protocol, the 67 Protocol. Okay, but after it signed this protocol, the fact was that there was, the protocol committed to protections for refugees, but between 1967 and into the 70s, basically the people who were coming into the US were just given refugee status based on who they were, not whether they had specific protection issues. So if they were members of communist countries, if they were Cuban or from the Soviet Union, they were welcome to the U.S. It was basically a situation where it was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So everyone people were coming to the U.S. in a very haphazard way. As long as you were politically sympathetic to the U.S. or antithetic to the U.S.'s enemies, you could come into the U.S. So then, in late 1970s, the U.S. was involved, as you know, in the Indo-Chinese, as it was then called, wars. The war in Vietnam, the U.S. bombing of Laos, the bombing of Cambodia, huge refugee flows from Cambodia, and subsequently from Vietnam, in which the U.S. became very involved just because the U.S. had a connection to this war, a deep connection, we might say. And so this connection prompted the U.S. to do something about the refugees that were being created from this war. And so in 1980, the U.S. Congress passed the Refugees Act. And the Refugees Act created a comprehensive system for granting asylum in the U.S. It was no longer this haphazard kind of let's only let the enemies of our enemies in. They brought the U.S. legal system, more in line with the 1967 protocol. It developed a proper definition of refugees that was more in line with the convention's definition, and brought them into compliance with the protocol, and it distinguished between refugees and asylum seekers. And a lot of other things that are in the Refugee Act that we can talk about. Okay, so that brings us to this Refugees Act, and I'm going to take it from here on, because from then on, the U.S. started resettling large numbers of refugees from 1980 on. So basically what we're going to talk about now is what we call the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. And there are basically two forms of humanitarian admission to the U.S. You can come into the U.S. as a refugee who's been resettled into the U.S., right? So that means your refugee status has been determined outside. It's been determined by outside of the U.S., you've been recognized as a refugee outside, and then you are brought into the U.S. But the second way you can come into the U.S. is through being an asylum seeker. You can knock on the U.S. door at the border and request asylum directly, right? So these are two ways in which you can come to the U.S. And there's a third humanitarian position. The first two, resettlement and asylum, are admission to the U.S. But the third way, which is not really a form of admission, is what's called temporary protected status in the U.S. And this is for people who are already in the U.S. So if you are in the U.S. and something awful happens to your country, like a natural disaster or a conflict breaks out or some serious problem occurs, the U.S. will parole you in to the country, allow you to stay in the country on a temporary basis until your country sorts itself out. So this means every year the U.S. has a list of countries from which people who are from those countries who are already in the U.S. can remain in the U.S. And this list of countries is up there. But the problem occurs when things in that particular country seem to be okay. And maybe the hurricane or the earthquake or the whatever has been 5 years ago, things have settled down, the country seems to be at peace. And then, because this is a temporary protected status, the temporary status is closed off. And that creates problems for people who maybe have been living in the US for a long time, because then they have to readjust their status. So this is a temporary position for people to be in, whereas being admitted to the US through resettlement or through asylum is a permanent form of immigration, okay? So I'm not going to talk about temporary protected status. I'm going to talk about resettlement and asylum. So let's just put this in a bit of global perspective. So when we look at the global population of refugees, as I'm sure most of you are aware, let's just take 1 year, say 2018. So in 2018, there were about 25.4 million refugees in the world. And from this map, you can see where they mostly are. Most of them are in the areas where the conflict is. In other words, as you know, most of those refugees are in neighboring countries. Okay? So 84% of the world's refugees live in the countries or in the region adjacent to the country of conflict. So the world's, I mean, I'm sure you know these numbers. I'll just give you some basic ones. The largest population of refugees right now in the world is the Syrians. They are now in a situation of protracted displacement, which is defined as being displacement for more than 5 years. They've been displaced since 2012, when they're, 11, but 12 really. And so they're well into a protracted displacement situation. There are about we estimate around 5 million. Most of them are in Turkey, 3.5 million in Turkey, about 1.5 million in Lebanon. That's already 5 million. There are more. There's about 600,000 in Jordan. As you know, there are 125,000 here in Egypt. And then there are scattered numbers elsewhere in the world. So we're probably well over 5 million at this point. And then, of course, there are the other major movements of refugees. There is the movement of South Sudanese into Uganda. This has happened in the last few years. Uganda now has 800,000 refugees in northern Uganda. There is the movement of Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh, which now has we're estimating around 900,000 Bangladesh, and so forth. What we're seeing in the Western Hemisphere, in Venezuela, is now an outpouring of people from Venezuela as Venezuela disintegrates, and we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people leaving and going into Colombia, which itself was a refugee-producing country until recently. So, and then, of course, as you know, all of you, I see you here, there is Somalia, which continues to be a problem. There is other parts of Sudan. There is Eritrea. There is Afghanistan. There is Iraq, there, and so forth and so on. So these refugees, for the most part, stay in the region. Now, in 2015, many of those refugees and other migrants headed for Europe. And so we were talking about a European crisis in Europe, and Germany did in fact take a large number of people that were leaving mostly Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But the fact is that when we look at what happens to these refugees, they are really the responsibility of the neighboring countries. The rest of the world, the US, Europe, Australia, the other countries, do not take very many refugees. The way they are supposed to take them is either through asylum or through resettlement. But when we look at the numbers of people who are resettled, as you probably know, that number is less than 1% of the world's population. So in 2018, there were, UNHCR estimated that there were 1.7 million refugees who were in need of resettlement, but only 55,000 who were actually resettled. Now, resettlement is intended as a specific protection strategy. It is not for everybody. It is for people who are called highly vulnerable, who are at risk in their countries of asylum, right? It's not for everybody who has fled. It is only for a very small group of people who are at risk, who are highly vulnerable, who are in danger in their countries of asylum. And the UN and UNHCR estimated there are 1.2 million of these people. But the countries of resettlement do not take them all. They take a much smaller number, 55 or so thousand. Where's the US in all this? Well, as you know, I'm sure, the US has traditionally been the country that resettles the highest numbers of refugees. In 2000 and, that number, as you're all, I'm sure, aware of, has dropped significantly under the Trump administration. But for many years, the US, the quota of refugees, I'll get to that in a minute, was around 80,000 coming in every year of resettled refugees, okay? So, but just to give you a global perspective of all of that, and then in terms of asylum, so that's resettlement. In terms of asylum, there are a number. Okay, so refugees coming out of their conflict-affected countries come into the neighboring countries. Often they do not actively apply for asylum. They are given refugee status by virtue of their prima facie status. Okay. But there are people, a large number, 3 or so, 0.1 million asylum seekers who actively seek asylum in other countries. And in the US, we have had asylum seekers knocking at the US border too. But this number has always been rather small. So in 2008, there were fewer than 5,000 asylum seekers coming and requesting asylum in the US. Last year, that number had gone up to 97,000 people. That's a 2,000% increase. These are the asylum seekers who are coming to the US southern border, mostly from the so-called countries of the Northern Triangle, which are the three countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua in Central America, who are making their way up through Mexico and applying for asylum on the US border. So this is the border crisis that Trump talks about all the time. And indeed, it is a crisis. We can make no mistake. He is not making this up. This is a very large escalation in the number of asylum seekers that we've seen in the last year. Okay, so what happens every year in the US is, and this has been the case since the 1980 Refugees Act was passed, is the president establishes an overall admissions ceiling. So every year the president sets a quota, a number of refugees who will be resettled to the US, and then that number in turn has regional allocations. So prior to President Trump, Obama had increased that quota somewhat to about, he had tried to push up the quota in his last year in power. In 2016, he had tried to push up the quota to about 110,000 people. But when Trump came to power, he cut that quota down drastically. So what we see, though, is that over time, this is a graph of how the US has resettled refugees since 1980. So back in 1980, the left side, this was the very high, around in the order of 250,000 Indo-Chinese refugees coming into the US, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laos and so forth coming into the US. Then it dropped off about in the 80s. Then it jumped up again in the early 90s, and of course I'm sure you can think of what caused that increase in refugees in the 90s. That was the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, and then also the Somalia, the outbreak of war in Somalia in late 1990, and then also other war, the Congo war escalated there and so forth. Then it dropped off a bit, and then after 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, US resettlement dropped off significantly and has basically picked up again until 2016, which was a very high point when Obama had pushed it up, hoping to resettle more Syrians. And then we had a major political earthquake, and Trump has cut that ceiling, admissions quota significantly. Okay, so this is where we are now. We had fairly steady levels of refugees being resettled into the US, 80 or so thousand admitted a year then also in addition asylum seekers. Now that number has gone down. So in 2019, this year, this fiscal year, the ceiling for refugees coming into the US is 30,000. That is the maximum number that will be allowed into the US, the lowest it's been in a long time. But as we'll talk about in a minute, even though there's that ceiling, we don't actually settle that many refugees. There is a gap between the ceiling and how many actually come into the US. And that is because of the heavy restrictions and security screening that is put on refugees, that not enough can even meet the ceiling. So once again, let's go back to look at the global perspective. How is the US doing compared to other countries? The two other countries that resettle the most refugees are Canada, and traditionally used to be Australia. And here's a look at how these countries have done all across the world. The resettlement of of refugees has been reduced. So the US has always accepted way more people, as you can see by the blue bar. And Canada has accepted fewer, and Australia has accepted fewer. But now all of those countries, and these are the main receiving countries, have reduced their intake because of security concerns. Other countries do resettle refugees, like Norway and a few others, but they are taking very small numbers of refugees. And some countries are taking less than 100. Japan traditionally takes maybe 20 refugees a year. And other countries take very, very small numbers. So when we're talking about resettlement, it's really these are the main countries. And they're not taking that many, but these are the main ones. So when people talk about resettlement, we're talking about, a couple, 10, 30, 40,000 refugees a year are being resettled globally. It's a very small number. So let me just talk briefly about what happens with the resettlement process. Maybe you know this. Basically what happens, and this has always been the case, is that as set up by the 1980 Refugees Act, what happens with resettlement is UNHCR refers a person to a resettlement country, let's say the US, to be resettled. There are some pre-screening that goes on by the US, their refugee support centers, and then a USCIS, a Homeland Security officer comes out, usually on the circuit, comes out a few times a year and interviews the person who's being referred for resettlement. And so a series of security checks and screenings then ensue, right? So you go through security checks to make sure you're not a terrorist, you go through medical checks, you go through a whole series of other screenings that take place, and make sure that you're going to be a good fit for the US. These screenings, this series of screenings can take up to 2 years for some countries because until the travel ban, for some countries, there were even enhanced screening processes for Syrians and Iraqis that took place. So all of these, the screening meant it could take up to 2 years before anyone was resettled, right? And when that finally happens, when you are passed through this process, IOM arranges your travel to go to the US or to wherever you're going. And as IOM knows, it's a loan. You get a ticket, it's a loan. You have to pay for it later. So you arrive in the US indebted. Anyway, minor detail. Okay, so then what happens with asylum? So if you're lucky, you get to the US, you get through this resettlement screening process, and you make it into the US, and you're good. When you're in the US, there are services available to you, not a lot, but there's some government assistance provided to you, not a lot, 9 months worth, some housing assistance and so forth. But you're into the US and presumably on the road to citizenship. It is a permanent immigration status, unlike in some European countries where it is not permanent. So what happens with asylum? So with asylum, the person comes and knocks on the door of the US, goes to the border official, Anybody can apply for asylum at any port of entry to the US, regardless of their, or they may also apply within the US. But they must apply from, if they're in the US, they must apply from within a year of their arrival in the US. And so then what happens? You go to the border official, and she or he conducts what's called a credible fear interview. She or he tries to determine right off the bat if what you're saying to him is going to get you into, is a credible, you have a credible reason for applying for asylum. If you do, if he passes you through that process, you are immediately put into detention, basically. And then you are going to have a court date set for you, and you will then come before the immigration judge. So what happens is, all of these asylum seekers, by law, this is not new, this is not Trump's border security, this is by law, have to go into detention, right, while they wait for the immigration judge to decide if they are to do the refugee status determination. But what in fact happens is that many people, not many, but some are deemed to be not at risk of flight, and so they are released from detention, often with GPS bracelets and so on, are monitored and so forth. But some are kept in detention centers. Then when you have your day in court before the immigration judge, the judge listens to your story, does the determination to see if you actually meet the US law definition of a refugee. And if you do, you're granted asylum and all is good. You're into the US, you have the same status as a refugee being resettled into the US, and you're now on this permanent path to citizenship. You are admitted into the US as a legal legal immigrant. Okay, so there's more, of course, I'm skimming through all this rather quickly because time is passing. I can see that you're getting very impatient. Dr. White, no? Okay, so let's talk about Trump. I'll just quickly go through his. Okay, so what's happened since 2017? So Trump came into power in 2017, and on the day of his inauguration instituted the travel ban. Basically what we're seeing with immigration policy under Trump is what some have called a sea change. It used to be that the US was a country of immigration. Trump is trying to change that. He is trying to have US no longer a country of immigration, and he has stated this explicitly. This is how he is going about changing policy goes well beyond all the drama and crisis about building the wall. In some cases, in some ways, that's even a distraction, because what is really going on in the US is a series of careful steps that the Trump administration is putting in place to decrease immigration to the US across the board, not just refugees and asylum seekers, but all kinds of immigrants. So he has tried, the administration has tried to decrease immigration admissions, so decrease the number of people coming in for all those reasons we talked about in the beginning, whether for work, or family reunification, or as refugees, and also has sought to increase deportations. Now, just to say one thing, increasing deportations is not new. Deportations went up under the Obama and the Bush regimes. So deportation has been going up across, for the last few administrations, but Trump has ramped that up some more. And since January 2017, he's done a number of other things. He's enhanced enforcement measures. So now we're at a situation where ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement Office officials, try to work with local police to do raids, do immigrant raids, to pick up people, to deport people, to, if you're out of status, to really focus on undocumented populations, to really go after people. So that's one in these enhanced enforcement. A second is vetting requirements. So to come into the US now, there's a whole new and much more intense set of vetting requirements. And of course, that applies to refugees as well. So if you are if you are being resettled, the vetting requirements, the security screening that takes place for being resettled has been enhanced significantly. Again, this is not only the US, this is globally, but Trump more. He has also reduced refugee admissions, like we said. He significantly reduced the ceiling, and has scaled back all kinds of temporary protection. You've seen his administration try to reduce temporary protective status, although there've been significant pushbacks against this. And just today, it's clear they tried to take away the South Sudan's TPS status, and the Homeland Secretary has rescinded that, so she's backed off from that now. But there's a lot of efforts to reduce temporary protection too. So, but what has Trump said about refugees? What he has said is that he doesn't feel the obligation to resettle refugees into the U.S. This is very different from Obama, who tried to increase the ceiling, as you recall. Trump's view is that humanitarian assistance and aid is the responsibility of nearby rich countries. And it is they who should help refugees to go home. Of course, this basically means for countries, rich countries, when the refugee crisis is far away from the US. But in his view of Syrians would be that countries around Syria should be the ones who take responsibility for Syrian refugees. They should not be brought all the way to the US. So when we look at his refugee policies, again, as you know, there were these travel bans. When he came into power, there was the first ban on refugee resettlement. This was ended, was pushed back by the courts, but was replaced with temporary, near total bans on refugees from specific countries. So refugees from Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Somalia are not permitted into the US anymore because those countries are on the list of travel ban countries. These bans were lifted in 2018. Again, the courts wouldn't allow it, but the Trump administration responded by expanding security processing for all refugee applications. So now, even though people can come, it is really difficult to get past these security new security measures. So these new security measures have created these bottlenecks in the system that make it very difficult for refugees to be resettled, because it's very difficult to get past these security. The smallest little thing can check the box, and then your material bans. If you've been seen to offer a cup of tea to the wrong person, who may be a terrorist group, that checks the box and you're off. So all of these kinds of security measures were significantly increased. Have been significantly increased in the last few years. So this is why we get this picture now. And this top line is the ceiling, the annual ceiling, the blue line, is the ceiling of what the president imposes, the maximum number that people can come in every year, starting in 1980. And we see in 1980 how high that ceiling was to allow the Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees into the US. And then it dropped down again, and it's dropped again. But now we see that the ceiling, it's rarely gone. The number of people who've been admitted has always been close to the ceiling, right? Except in 2001, 2002, after 9/11. Then that was a blip that kind of closed off resettlement for a while, but then it picked up again and went back to normal. But now, you see the last line on the right, the ceiling is much higher than the actual number of people who were admitted to the US. And this is because even though he is saying 27,000 last year, 30,000, whatever it is, we're not admitting that many to the US because of these security measures. Okay, so rather than end on this negative note, we should talk about what the response in the US has been to Trump's increased restrictions. And what we're seeing in the US is that it's been more difficult than Trump and his administration would like to create a more restrictive immigration policy because of the US political system. And the system creates legal and political challenges that have blocked some of Trump's most ambitious aims. So Congress, the House the Democrats are in control. It's going to be even more difficult. But even when both the House and the Senate were controlled by Republicans, there was no appetite for new immigration law and new immigration policy. No one wants to touch this. Politically, it's a third rail, as we say. No one wants to deal with new immigration policy. It's very tricky. So Congress is not going to help him with this. Then there are the courts, the judicial system in the US. And they have, up to now, in the last few years, 2 years, have pushed back, have disallowed a lot of Trump's, initiatives. They have blocked the travel ban. They have slowed or halted or slowed key initiatives. For example, they've stopped the separation of families at the border and other things. They've made it difficult for him to push his policy along. And then even more interestingly is that in the US, there's a federal system. So the federal government decides what immigration should be. As in most countries, it's the immigration, and including refugee policy, is decided by the national government. But in the US, the federal system has 52 states, and each of those states has its own government. Normally, those states would fall in line with federal immigration policy. But many of the states, especially those who are only those who are opposed to Trump, have resisted Trump's ideas, and even more, beyond just the state, at the level of cities and towns, there have been cities and town municipalities and mayors and so forth who have refused to go along with Trump's new requirements. For example, have refused to allow their police forces to cooperate with immigration, ICE officials who are trying to catch undocumented people. So at the level of towns and cities, at the level of states, there has been resistance and pushback against Trump's policies. Nevertheless, however, sadly, the view is amongst immigration people, I think generally, that Trump, through incremental changes, not the border, leave aside the border, it's through these incremental changes and these precedents, these legal precedents that he's setting, he will be able to change US immigration policy over time. And if he gets another term, then we will see that process continue. So even though there is this resistance in the US to him, and there's a huge political resistance in the US to all of these things we've been talking about, he is still going to whittle away and erode the US's immigration position. And then we are probably going to be looking at significantly different immigration policy in the next year, and if he wins, in the next few years. So I'll stop there and see if you will agree with me or not.
Thank you very much, Karen, for a fascinating talk and the information that you gave us about the evolution and the development in immigration, and in particular in refugee policy and President Trump's policy towards refugees in particular. So I will open the floor. I may have a few comments to make at the end, but for the moment I will open the floor for questions and very brief comments, because fortunately there are so many, but if interventions are long, it will be difficult to manage. So, Paris 2, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I mean, those of us who've been worked in the past as immigration advocates in the U.S. and hope to see some form of comprehensive immigration reform and actual legalization of undocumented, populations are feeling especially despondent. But I have a question about also just this global trend, because of course the US was conspicuously absent during the Global Compact on refugees and migration. And I don't know, I mean, if, especially with regards to the Global Compact on refugees, because we already have the 1951 Convention, but there are clearly protection gaps, right? There's clearly not enough refugees being resettled, crises are protracted, local integration in host countries is increasingly difficult, this is pushing irregular migration, the current situation is untenable, right? We have a legal framework that doesn't address things like climate change, other forms of displacement that are just going to increase. And so I guess I'm curious to see, aside from the US, what do you see as a new sort of global paradigm that those of us who work as advocates in this field can adopt to, to address what is going to be really critical in the coming years?
Thank you very much, Paris. We'll take a few questions and then we'll ask Karen to react. Who? Yes.
Thank you very much. The human aid, the new policy of, countries are responsible for the refugees from their neighbors. When did this come about? Or is this a Trump change? What is GPS? Can you explain what GPS is? And has it reached the level in the States where immigration officers stop you in the street and ask for your papers?
With immigration officers, I'm sorry?
Stop you in the street and
Stop
ask
you in
for
the
your
street.
papers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the session.
Please,
thank you for the lecture. I want to ask you about the de facto refugee. We talked in the discussion that there is a temporary license, like temporary status for the refugees entering to the US. And after a period of time, they are returned to their homes. Depending on what, the US are determining that the refugees are not more capable for being refugees in US.
thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll ask Professor Jacobsen to react.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. Let me go back a little bit. We have seen 3 executive orders regarding the refugees, and it started with an executive order, and we have seen people who's been held in the airport, like people with permanent resident status, and then it was taken to the courts, and we have seen another watered down version. It's, of course, initially it started as an emergency, as the president said. He was quoted saying a lot of bad people are pouring in, and it's an emergency. But we have seen 3 executive orders, and it continued with even cabinet secretaries in the US are being operated with people who are known as immigration hardliners. So my question is, because I work with refugees who has been in the pipeline for years, even before Trump thought to run for office. My question is, how do we know that they are operating in goodwill now with people applications? Thank you.
Karen, could you?
Yeah, yeah,
Wish-
okay.
like
Gosh, I have to
yeah.
remember because I'm sorry, I don't seem to have a pen. So just remind me of your question again.
It was more about the sort of global, this global.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right,
Global trend.
the compact of refugees.
Thank you. A global trend, yeah. Well, I mean, there have been a lot of the New York Declaration. There's all kinds of sort of global initiatives that are happening and have been since the 2015 crisis. Some of them seem to lead in certain directions. Who knows? I mean, it's easy to knock them, as I'm doing here, and to say that nothing's going to change. I am myself somewhat more of a sort of a, I guess, realist, who would say that what drives these issues is not international agreements and conventions and whatnot, but what states do. And in fact, what we're seeing when we look at what states do is it's bad. The states are trying, Europe and the US and others are trying to push out their borders. Basically what we're seeing in Europe is securitization of borders and then pushing out the borders into North Africa. That's what we're looking at here. And, Merkel's, Germany's policy of admitting almost 1 million refugees was a huge political error for her. And it has been will be the end of her coalition. So and what we're seeing in Europe is the rise of anti-immigration right politicians, and that's where it's going. Whether it will all calm down now because immigration because the arrivals have dropped off so much this year, and whether everyone will just calm down and things will reestablish, maybe not. But when we look at what's happening at the level of states, I'm not sure it's going to be enough to offset I'm not sure that the global compacts on refugees and the global compact on migration is going to be enough to do this. Your point about how the climate change and so forth, these people are not being addressed. They are being addressed in the global compact on migration is trying to address. But it's not enforceable, and it's all states. If they want to, they can, and it's not push them too hard. And so it's not. I don't think we're into a period of that where immigration, if we look at it in the long run, immigration is going to go down for a while. Will it go up again? And then, of course, the other major force in the global force, is the smuggling industry. And as immigration goes down legally, the smuggling industry increases. So we're not going to see a decline in the number of people moving. We're going to just see a change in how they move, for sure. And it's not good. But we may just be in this period of sort of knee-jerk reaction after the 15 crisis, and maybe things will even out a bit. Who knows? Yeah. Okay, so your question about, sorry, remind me of your question. You asked about GPS. That was an easy one. What was your other question?
When did human aid become the responsibility of the neighbor
And whether immigration officers can stop you in this.
Yes. Okay, so Trump cannot tell what other countries have to do. So there's no policy that says other countries have to do it, but that's what he's said should happen. That's his belief about what should happen.
He's the first one who said it.
Oh, no, I mean, lots of others agree with this too, but he says it outright. He just states it. He says a lot of things to his base that pleases his base and pleases a lot of other people too, who won't admit it. And there are many European politicians who feel the same, but they don't say it because they're a bit more subtle than Trump. Or some do actually say it. I can think of several politicians who do say it. On the point about GPS, the GPS is a global positioning system that is a bracelet, an ankle bracelet that you wear that tells the government where you are. It's like your GPS in your car. So basically is a bracelet to help them monitor where you go so you can't disappear. One thing I didn't talk about, but this raises it, is Trump has said that the asylum system on the border is what he calls a catch and release. So what this means is that when you go through this credible fear and the interview, and the border official says, okay, it sounds like you're going to make it if you get asylum. So now you come in, you go into the detention center, and you wait for your immigration date, court date, right? But like I said, some people are released with this GPS bracelet. Now, Trump is saying too many people are being released from the detention center, not monitored, and they never come back to their court case. So last year, there were 35,000 court case dates. We have a backlog in the US, a backlog of about 750,000 cases in the court system. 750,000. That's how long you have to wait. You're going to be waiting between your credible fear interview and your court date. It's not, you don't always go to the back of the line. It's a little bit, but of those, there were 35,000 court cases in the US last year where the judge actually had you in front of him or her, right? Of those 35,000, 10,000 people did not show up for the court date. That was the catch and release that he's aiming at, right? Now, why did those people not show up, is the question. Did they just think, I'm going to stay in the US undocumented and just take my chances here because I won't get through the... Is that what they thought? And are they just out there adding to the undocumented part? Or they were deported. They were not, they didn't have the right documents at the right time, something went wrong, and they were deported. Or they just didn't understand something. So there are all kinds of reasons. I mean, it's an issue. But Trump is sure that this is a problem. This is why we have such a problem here in the US, undocumented and so forth. So those restrictions on the person are likely to increase to prevent the what he calls catch and release. Okay, and then lastly, and can you stop people on the street? Yes, you can stop people on the street. If you go through a traffic violation or something, or if you can, if the police are cooperating with you, then the immigration officer the police can turn you over to the immigration officer. In some cities, not all.
My question was, what basis the U.S. determined to end the status of the
temporary. So temporary protected status. You are not a refugee. If you're a refugee or an asylum seeker and you make it into the U.S., you are permanently in the U.S. You're there. Temporary protected status is not a refugee status. It's only for people whose countries kind of ran into problems while they were already in the US. Maybe they were a student there, or they were a tourist or something. It depends. It usually goes for several years, but then it can change and then you're out, because it is a temporary status. So it's not the same as refugees. I really shouldn't even have put it in the same, but it is a form of humanitarian migration. Yeah, and what was your question again?
Whether they're operating in a goodwill.
Who they?
I would say use USCIS.
Oh.
Because we have seen a lot of stalling for the past few years.
Yeah, I can't speak for those agencies. I would say in both the State Department, which manages resettlement, and Homeland Security, which is USCIS, and which manages the border. So these are two different departments, right? The Homeland Security manages border, who comes into the U.S. State Department manages the refugees who are outside, so they're the ones, they fund refugee programs here in Egypt and so forth, and they are doing resettlement. I would say that people especially in the State Department, because I've worked with them for many years, are of goodwill, definitely, yes. Not the political appointees, not them, but the ordinary people who are working away in the salt mines in the bureaucracy, they definitely have goodwill. It's like the equivalent of a foreign policy, a foreign ministry. They want diplomacy, they want international relations, they recognize the problems of refugees. So, Homeland Security, also, there are people of goodwill and there are people of not so goodwill. It's a huge agency. There are definitely refugee officers and asylum officers who are, they've come through my own program. I have students who've gone on to be refugee officers and asylum officers, and I know very well that they definitely have goodwill. Some of them are in this very room, and they are not refugee officers. But so definitely there are people of goodwill, and then there are people of not goodwill. But it's the same in any bureaucracy. So,
Questions, comments?
I have one
Nice, go ahead.
I'm just wondering why, because you said there is a resistance at the state level and at the town and cities, on one hand, and then there is the Congress and opposition.
Yeah.
But why at the end you said that despite that you think that Trump will, if particularly will be re-elected, then there will be changes in the asylum
Yeah.
system? Why do you think?
Because immigration policy is determined ultimately by the federal government, because that's the law in the U.S. It's the federal government who decides who shall come into our country and how the border will be managed. That's the border. But also what will happen to people inside the country who are not U.S. citizens. So we've got 45 million people in the U.S. who are not, well, they may be citizens, but they're foreign born, or they may be on the path to citizenship, but they're foreign born, not yet citizens. And for those people, it's the responsibility of the federal government. So when states or cities resist that, they're up against quite a big problem. You know, and the federal government can bear down on them. It can threaten them, as it has. It can threaten them with taking away federal money. That's what's happened in Massachusetts, my state, where the government will say, okay, you're not going to cooperate with our federal ICE officials, the immigration custom, then we're going to take away your block grants. Then we're going to take away federal funding. So they can threaten the states and cities that way. And then, of course, you know, mayors and state officials are elected. And there are some people in states who don't feel this way, don't agree, and then they'll vote them out of office. And then because we lost all this federal funding because of your liberal policies, now we're voting you out of office. And so there's always this problem in a democracy of, you know, nobody likes it if the immigrants are getting stuff or we're losing stuff because of the immigrants. So, and if the politicians push that message enough, it works. And you know, Trump is very good at pushing this message, very good. And it's not only his base who buys it, not at all. And so it's a problem, as with many European politicians. Very good. It's an easy message, very straightforward. Yeah.
What about supporting people who live in country like Egypt and the other country neighbor to disaster area? Because Europe make an agreement with Egypt and other country to support these their victims and make them be one of the society in the neighbor country.
I'm sorry. I didn't get the question. Can you ask again?
Is there a plan to support the neighbor country to help these victims?
Yeah.
So they can't leave to America?
I see. Is there a plan to help the neighboring countries so people don't leave? Yeah. Well, I mean, you mean by the U.S.? Yeah. The U.S. I mean, the U.S. State Department gives a substantial amount of aid, of funding to the UNHCR, and also bilaterally to countries who are, and through the World Bank, and through other sources, through other intergovernmental organizations, to try to support countries like Lebanon and Jordan and to some extent Egypt, but really Lebanon and Jordan, who are really taking the brunt, say, of the Syrian refugees, or Uganda or Kenya. So there is definitely funding and assistance in that form that is made available to neighboring countries to help them absorb the burden of refugees. For sure that is happening, right? You could say, oh, well, yeah, that's just a way to keep them in that country. But it's also the case that it's a way to help the country bear this burden, because no country is going to take off, is going to resettle very, very large numbers of people. It never has happened. And we've got 25 million refugees we're talking about. They are not all going to be resettled. Most of them are going to stay in these countries. So rich countries do help those countries. You could say not enough. You could say they help them in ways that are trying to contain them there. And clearly some of these bilateral, the Turkey-EU deal, the EU-Libya deal, these are clear bilateral deals that have been made in order to keep people in those countries, in Libya and in Turkey. And it works. And in Egypt, it works. The government stops the smugglers from going. It's very simple. So, but the fact is that that has to be a solution. Countries, these neighboring countries must get support to help them absorb refugees, because they're not going anywhere else. They're not going to be resettled. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I have two brief questions. The first is in regard to Trump's amendments, I'll say in this way, to systemically to the immigration policy of the U.S. Whether or not he is in office for a shorter or longer amount of time, I'm wondering how quickly you think these systemic changes can be hopefully undone by future administrations, and whether you think that might be a faster or shorter process. And then my next question is in regards to asylum seekers on the southern border. I'm wondering of the numbers, and again you mentioned a backlog, but I'm wondering of the numbers of maybe some of the newer asylum seekers on the border who have maybe appeared in court, what the numbers are that they're being granted asylum, and whether you think a more collective acknowledgement of the issues happening in these countries could impact maybe a more positive response to their asylum seeking. And please let me know if the latter question didn't make as much sense. Thank you.
Great. Okay,
The last question, probably. Yes. You have a question, Obi, and then Obi. And then to
Thank you. I want to ask, is Trump affecting the economy by building this wall, and is it helpful?
And?
I'm asking, is Trump affecting the economy by building the wall?
Yeah.
And is it helpful for the country?
Oh, helpful. Oh, okay.
And how is it helping the country? Is he doing it out of his own will, or is it to support the country?
Thank you. Obi, go ahead with your question.
I had a question. My question is, we hear many sides of an argument, but it's always helpful, and I believe your presentation is very wholesome in seeing everything. I want you to talk about, I'm asking about the legitimacy of the security argument that Trump is putting forward. How serious is it? Is it valid? I read a paper that said it's one of terrorist strategies now to use flows of people to carry out what they would like to do. But at the same time, some people are saying, okay, the securitization is offset by things like the Global Compact that says, okay, we can take care of them in neighboring countries. But then we also know that these neighboring countries have issues, especially many of them plagued with corruption, and at the end of the day, the aid doesn't get to the refugee. How can we offset that dilemma? That's my question. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so these are super great questions because they're nicely linked. So your question about could these things be rolled back if he wasn't elected again? Yeah, and that's a very interesting thing to think about, whether in fact, immediately you could say that, well, Congress could so the executive orders could be rolled back, maybe not. It depends who comes in and also what happens with Congress, because it might just be easier to let things roll for a little bit or let things slide the way they have been. Maybe, nothing is going to suddenly just switch back to being what it was before. Maybe the quota will be increased, the ceiling will be increased. Again, maybe. But it leads to this question because of your question, Obi, because what is the security threat here of immigration? I mean, if you asked Europeans that, they would say there's a lot of, we've got some problems here with that. We've had attacks, many attacks in Europe from refugees, from asylum seekers, from immigrants. Let's face it. And so I think, the reason there's a lot of support for anti-immigrant groups is because people really are worried about this. They really are. And you could see why people are worried about it. Why? I mean, immigration is going up. People are fleeing from countries where there are jihadist groups and so forth. And surely someone could. I mean, it's not an unusual position or an unreasonable position to be worried about that. So then that leads to so even if if we got a super liberal group of House and a president that came in, would such a super liberal House and president suddenly roll back all our immigration restrictions? I don't think so. But so then the question is, so what will happen? Actually, what I think will happen is what a lot of you have been saying is there will be outsourcing of security. So what Trump is proposing of that people apply for asylum in Mexico, and that basically the in-country processing happens, and then we move all the asylum process out of the country. It's not a terrible idea. Yes, there is corruption and problems, like you're saying, in Mexico, but is it better to be in a detention center separated from families, but in a detention center in the U.S. with a huge backlog ahead of you and you don't know what's going to happen, and then you could well be deported back? Or is it better to have the process happen in the neighboring country, and you haven't gone through all the trouble? I mean, what we're seeing now, the reports in the paper now is of buses that are going to Guatemalan towns, and tour buses. And the announcement is made, everybody bring your children and let's go, pay your money and we'll go up to the border and you apply for asylum. The numbers are ramping up significantly now. The smuggling process has now figured out what's needed, and we are seeing a really massive wave of people coming across through Mexico. How are you going to discourage? Because those people are not going to get asylum. They are not going to get asylum in the U.S. No matter you fleeing from gang violence and drug violence, drug cartel violence in the Northern Triangle is not going to get you asylum. That's not part of the refugee definition. So you're going to make all this money and trouble and do all this stuff and get to the U.S. border, and you're going to be pushed back, either that or sitting in a tent. So maybe the whole process should happen. I mean, that's where we're going to be headed in my prediction, is that there are going to be more processing outside of the country to prevent this pressure on the southern border that is really unsustainable and creates really serious problems for people. And never mind about impoverishing them, because they paid all their money and gone into serious debt to pay the smuggler. I mean, we're not looking at this back end of what happens to migrants who are convinced by the smuggler that they can make it to the U.S. and spend their life savings on that. And this is a serious problem that we have to kind of really get our heads around. And, I mean, I don't have a solution, but it's not just piling people into our detention centers. That's not a solution. So.
Thank you, Karen. I'll have a few questions, few comments, in fact, and I will benefit from our friendship to probably express an analysis that puts into question some of the things that have been said, or to raise a few other observations. I think that smuggling is not at the origin of the flows of people. Smuggled cigarettes are not international trade. Smuggling is something, international trade is something else. So I think smuggling is just a small portion of population movement. If you take Guatemala, there is responsibility like responsibility for Vietnam or Cambodia, there is a responsibility of the United States for what has happened in Central America over the last century, at least. In 1954, the United States intervened in Guatemala And you know, Guatemala is one of the countries where we have the highest murder rates. So South America is terrible. Guatemala, Honduras, all of these countries, you know, and these countries have been always described as the back garden of the United States. They are in the zone of influence of the United States. So this is how I think we need to look at the international system and subsystems in the international system. You know, we're both political scientists. There's a theory of the hegemon. The hegemon has responsibilities towards the international system. And I think that Trump is undermining the position of the United States in the international system. Because if he refuses, so you see, I'm sorry, with all due respect to Central Europe, and I have a friend from Central Europe here, but frankly, if the leader of Poland says something, it's fine. I mean, it's not good, but it's okay. But if it comes from the President of the United States, this is something else. You see? So I think there is, what Trump is doing, of course, I agree completely with you, is that this does not come from nowhere. Trump has just pushed the door a little bit. But frankly, this is dismantling the international legal system and the international institutional system. If Colombia is supposed to take responsibility for Venezuelan refugees and Turkey and Lebanon for Syrian refugees, then what do we do of the international legal system? What do we do with the... So I think there is something really, you know, the backlog. Look at the backlog, for instance. Of course, all the day you're saying smaller government, smaller government, smaller government. Of course, you end up with no judiciary, no sufficient judiciary. And you end up with large informality in the United States economy, which absorbs the irregular migrants. And so you also have to look at the economic system. So I think what is wrong really is deeper. The refugee policy of Trump is just one aspect of his outlook towards. You know, we have not mentioned one group of refugees, extremely important, the Palestinian refugees. Of course, because they are out of the legal system but Palestinian refugees, Trump has even cut off the funding for UNRWA. How do you want to keep the Middle East stable with all these refugees and all, I mean, refugees, what have you? And if the Middle East, which is a subsystem of the international system, breaks down, what will happen to neighboring subsystems? See, I think this is extremely dangerous, what is being done. I think this is what I wanted to say. I think, frankly, the realism, the extreme outdated realism of the 1940s is, frankly, not the way to go forward. But what I also understand is that when you're about to lose a battle, you fight hard, and they are fighting hard.
Yeah.
Trump and his people are fighting hard, but I don't think they will carry the day. I don't think so. What do you think?
I think from your words to God's ears. I mean, we are all hoping that I think would all agree with you, and yes, this is, you know, an undermining of the international system is what we're seeing, for sure. And across, whether it's UNRWA, whether it's many different things, let's not even think about our environmental laws that are going. But yeah, I mean, I think that I also think that this anti-immigration trope that is going across, that Trump is riding the wave on, he is not alone. And in many other countries, this is also what is happening. And whether it's just, I mean, you're making a normative argument about what should happen. I agree with you, this should happen. We should be doing what we've always been doing, which is being part of the international system, and the US being the hegemon in it who is supporting that international system. But Trump is uprooting it, he's trying to uproot it. Whether he's able to succeed, I don't know. But he is, even if he has many people that are opposed to him, but I think the argument is that he's going to make some difference, even if he disappears next year. And actually, there's a lot of worry about what would happen if he's voted out of office. It's not at all clear that he will just step aside and go back to making his money or whatever. But it's not at all clear that there are a lot of worries in the US that he will not just step aside. We cannot even believe that this is even possible, that the US could worry about a thing like that, that this is what is being talked about. And so, is it just a blip, or are we seeing some more substantial change? I don't know. A lot of it will happen next year, will be determined next year. But I also don't think that Trump is alone and the only one. There are many others, and we're seeing it in Europe emerging. I think he's not just a blip on the screen. I think maybe seeing a real shift in the international system now, maybe caused by immigration.
No, I share your worry, and I share what you have just said. My concern is that this sort of any system has to change, has to evolve. But this sort of change in the system is extremely dangerous. It's not from here to God. No, it's not. It's not an idealist thing. In fact, not at all. In fact, what I mean is to prevent a breakdown of the international system that could bring about extremely, extremely unpleasant and dangerous things. This is what happens, in Europe, for instance, that is encouraged by this is fascism, which was vanquished in 1945, taking its revenge. The far right taking its revenge on its defeat in 1945. Look at Salvini, look at these people. So I think this is much more, it's more than migration and refugees, in fact. It goes much further.
Oh, yeah.
And by saying refugees, migration, all of the economic policies of Trump are not discussed. Income gaps that are being widened and widened and widened. I think this is really, all of this focus on refugees and migration is to divert attention from the real issues. And unfortunately, they have been able to divert attention. So we need just to keep saying that there are other issues of great importance. But I share your worry. And again, I thank you very much for extremely, extremely informative.
I just have a comment. Because the gentleman here mentioned something about the economy.
Yeah, the wall.
But we have. I mean, you can discuss after. You can discuss after.
I just had a comment. That's all.
So we discuss it later. So please join me in thanking Professor Jacobsen for an extremely interesting, informative, and fascinating talk that raised so much interest, and that made you all discuss, made quite a few of us discuss and seek additional information and offer different perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Really very, very, very.